Well, what we're looking at today is going to be workflow, again, continuing our discussion of workflow, and we'll be looking at really the second part of this discussion of workflow around the use of escalation rules. Now, in terms of what we'll be looking at, we'll be thinking about the way in which notifications are able to be created. These are on-screen alerts, very simple. They can actually issue notifications as in the form of an email generated from within the system as well. So we'll be looking at the capabilities of that. We'll also look at the idea that within escalations there's a lot of information that can take place or a lot of behavior that can take place automatically, driven by time, not by the user choosing to press a button, by simply the passage of time and the state of the data. So there'll be a number of trigger points that we'll be looking at and understanding what actually we need to understand as part of that. So there's a number of things that we'll look at as we first of all look at the feature at a fairly high level, fairly from a user's perspective, and then we'll dip into the software. And so we'll be looking at the use of the workflow rules table, how that fits in with the other metadata tables, the idea of the escalation table, and the way in which some of the views which are used within the system work. And then we'll go through the creation of an escalation rule, so understanding the idea of the firing point or the trigger mechanism, and then think about some of the other concepts that sit around escalation rules. These are ideas of succession, interaction with other rules, and also the idea of recursion, some of the problems that may occur with escalation rules because we're changing data automatically. So what I want to do is I want to go through the process of creating for us a simple escalation rule. Escalation rules are not difficult to understand. There's something of a myth to think that escalation rules are hard. Our best place to go and understand escalation rules is within the screens itself. So we actually can use CRM to teach us how escalation rules work. We can find these by going into advanced customization. So here I am in the administration screens, advanced customization, looking at escalation. And we've got a whole host of manually built escalation rules. And it is important to understand that there is actually no difference in internal structure between a simple notification and an escalation rule. The only difference is that simple notifications give you an interface to define the rule. With escalation rules, you have to define everything about that rule. And if I look to one of these rules at the end, I'm going to look at where we've got a communication reminder. We can start to see how an escalation rule is structured. We can see that we need to link it in with a database table or a view. It needs to have a name, obviously, so we can control it. It's going to be of the type of escalation rule, that's all logical, and then it has a trigger SQL clause. The trigger SQL clause is the where clause. This is what we see within the database when we look at wherever we saw that from within the workflow rules, this field WK rule _ where clause. So that's what we have to build ourselves. We have to be aware that our notifications are, or our escalation rules are either notifications to show things within the screen and to do things now when a user is using the system, or they can be removed from when the user is using the system and be fired by the escalation behavior, so fired behind the scenes without dependency of having the user logged on. In this rule, we can see that we are referencing the current system date and time. All escalation rules are ultimately based on time, And here you can see that we are basing it as well on the current logged on user. This is the merge codes that we understand here. So hash U is whoever is the current user, hash T is the current system time. And we're able to understand that that's merged out to get this. And in addition, we can see that there is a check to see whether the communication is still pending. Now, if that's the case, then what it will do is it will do the action underneath here, which is to show the notification on the screen. When we show the notification on the screen, we have to determine what the message is. This is the message in here. We have an action type that can be followed, and then we can see that we are basing it on a particular column within this. Now I'm going to tie everything together by building my own escalation rule, and we're going to see that this is actually not a difficult thing to get to and understand. So to do this, first of all, what I need to do is to identify the field that I'm going to use to hold the data that is time-based. Now, a lot of the information that we will use, a lot of the existing escalation rules uses instead of a field inside the main entity, it'll link it into the escalation table. I'm not going to use the escalation table here. You can see that these are the views that we're using, and the escalation table is then linked to within inside this table. But actually I can go in, if I look at my database table cases, I can see that in here I have got a field inside directly the case table called case notified time. So I've got a field in here that I could potentially use for this purpose. So if I do select notify time or case notify time and bring that to the front, we can see this field at the moment doesn't have any value within it, but I could be using that. Now that field though, if I go in as my user over here, which is my Kylie Ward user, and I was to look at a case that I might have assigned to me by default, I'd look at this and I can see that actually I don't have a case notified time anywhere displayed on the screen. It's an unused field within the system. So one of the things that I'm going to do, if I switch back as a system administrator, is to make sure that that particular field is being used. And I only actually need to use it in the context of workflow. So when a new case is created, I want to be able to know that that case is in existence and be triggered by the value contained in the notification time. So this is where escalation rules may interact with user-driven behavior. So escalation rules are time-based, and the rest of the workflow is user-driven behavior. So I'm going to come into advanced customization, look at workflow, and I'm going to find my default case workflow in here, and I'm going to edit my workflow so that I can change the new case rule. So I'm going to come into new case, and in here what I'm going to do is amongst the fields I'm going to set a field value. So I'm going to set a new workflow action. So I'm going to set the column value, and in here the field that I'm interested in is notify time, and what I want to do is just put in a value in here. Now whenever you're dealing with a field that is a time-based field, what you enter in here is the offset in seconds. So if I put a 0 in here, I'm basically saying the offset is now. It's straight away. I'm not putting it into the future in any way. I just need to make that a hidden field, so I don't need to see what I'm doing here. I can just save it and that notify time will be entered into the system. I can save my rule, and I can activate the workflow. So as my user for this particular company, what I can do now is to decide to create, underneath cases, I can create here a new case, and what I should find is for this test case, I say test case, make sure that I filled in all the other mandatory fields in here. Make sure it's assigned to me as Kylie Ward, and then choose save. What I should see inside the database, if I now run this again, the last field that I've entered, the last record that I've entered, now has the time that the record was created. And so we do see how we now have a notify time inside the system. What I can do, now that I know that there's data inside the notify time field, I can start to use this for the definition of an escalation rule. And so back inside my system administrator screens, I can come away from the workflow into advanced customization, into escalation, and I can create for myself a brand new escalation rule. I'm going to call this escalation rule new case alert. And I've got a new case alert, and I'm going to be basing it on cases. I could base it on a view, and it is preferable that you base on a view. So I could look as to which view that I wanted to use. So if I look at existing views within the system, and so if I have a look at my database and look down into the tables that are, sorry, not the tables, the views that are within the system, and I can see that I've got a number of different views that I could use. I could base it on something like the V summary case view. So V summary case view. So my view is V summary case, and I'm interested in the cases table within that view. The next thing to do is to work out my trigger clause, and what I know that I'm interested in is the case stage should be equal to be logged. If I look at my case that I defined in here, this is the brand new test case, that I want to find that the stage is logged and the status is in progress. So stage is logged and my case status is in progress. But that would find everything, so I need to narrow it down into, first of all, where the user is me, the Kylie Ward or whoever the case is assigned to, and so where I can say the case underscore assigned user ID is equal to, and then I can use this merge code. So we've got these merge codes that we've seen that we can use. Hash U is the current user ID. So hash U, and we want the notification time to be less than now as well. So I can say case notify time is less than, and do I mean less than? Or less than, greater than. I'll check that in a moment. But here we have the next information, and that's going to be hash T, because that's the system date and time. Now, I'm not going to enable it just yet, because so far we've not indicated any action that we're taking, and so I'm going to just use save and compare that with what I've done within my communication reminder so far, what I had here. And so you've got where we've got the escalation time is less than the hash t as well. So we've got this idea that our own new case alert is using a very similar structure on finding the time. But we need to give this an action. No escalation actions found for this rule, so we need to define an escalation action. Inside our system, the actions that you can perform with any particular workflow rule are going to be limited to what makes sense. So escalation rules can't rely on there being any interface and can't be involved in any user-driven process. So there are a number of things that you can't do inside an escalation rule, largely associated with if you like, where you'd have the reasonable expectation that there was an interface in place, like the creation of a task or an opportunity or things like that. They would really expect to be present, an interface would expect to be present, but we're doing this behind the scenes automatically. So some actions don't make sense, and we can see that clearly here within the escalation rule. So what I want to do is, if I'm going to perform an action, is to show a notification on the screen. So I can show a notification on the screen, and now what column is this notification based on? The column is the notify time, so I need to have a look through this. This is showing us all of the columns that are associated with the view that the case is based on the escalation rule is based on, but I need to come to case notify time, and I need to be clear that this is coming from the cases table and not from the view, because you cannot update a view, you can only update a table. And then we need to give it a message. So I'm going to say that this is a message called new case alert, which doesn't seem to be a very good message, but please understand that what this is a caption code, and this is a link into a translation by which we can add in more details. So I'm going to choose save, and once I've saved this, if I return back inside here, you can see that I've got a little asterisk, which is the symbol to indicate that I can open up now the translation screens. So if I click on my new case alert, I can fill in here the details that I want. So in my US translation, or in my UK translation, I can put in the information that I want, and I can say, you have a new case assigned, and I can put in here case underscore description. So I'm just going to put in one of the fields that you've got, as well as the text for the information that we want, and then I can save that, and that's stored inside the custom captions table within metadata, or the translations area within inside metadata. And I can choose that, and what I'll do now is I will enable my rule and choose save. If I switch over into Kylie Ward here in her screen, I don't think as yet. Oh, look at that! We've seen that we've got a new case has been created, but that's the old notification. We haven't got the new notification. So if I go and dismiss all, and we can see now a new case has been created, and we're seeing another check for the information that we've on the screen. So this is the notification that I defined here. We're seeing my behavior in understanding what that case is. Okay, so we've gone through and we have defined the escalation rule. I used here the very simple way of checking in my escalation rule the idea of notification time is less than the current time, which is fine. We can use dates and times in a much more sophisticated way, so we can start to find out and use the date information in any way that we like, if we're used to the idea of using functions to get date parts. We could even restrict the firing point of an escalation rule so that it only fires on a Tuesday if we wanted to, or on a particular time within the day as well. So we can be very clear about doing this. And when we're performing the actions within the system, I use the notification onto the screen, and the notification onto the screen is going to put the information up here, as we can see, onto the alerts. Now, notifications, as you can see, can be snoozed or they can be dismissed. When I defined my rule, I needed to be clear that inside my rule, let's go and have a look at the cases table and filter those. So if on this rule that we defined here, this was on the case table, and we were linked into the column notified time. My user, Kylie Ward, if she now decides to snooze one of these, and I might snooze that for 10 minutes, we can see that that's been disappeared from the alerts. But in the database, what has happened, if we look at the information that's in here, we can see that we may well have found that our test case is snoozed out with a new time. So if this is all to do with the information that's available inside the notified time screen. Okay, I'm going to just switch away from that and switch back into my presentation. Okay, so we've looked at the idea of notified time, we've looked at the idea of time comparisons, and we have mentioned as well for some rules we'll be using the escalation table that it may want to use. I mentioned the idea that we are writing a rule that is fired every 5 minutes. Our simple rule that we created as the system administrator here is a notification rule that displays a message on the screen. It doesn't matter if every 5 minutes the information in the notification area is redrawn and re-alerted to a user. But it would matter if, as the rule was fired, and we had chosen to write, instead of a notification rule displaying the message on screen, we had chosen instead to have this as an email notification. So something every 5 minutes, sending out an email is not a good thing to do. And so what we'll find is that escalation rules which are more sophisticated and are writing out emails include in themselves something called a stop clause. So if I filter all rules, and I'm interested in a particular rule that is here called the email reminder. So if I look at this email reminder rule, what we can see is that we've introduced the idea of a stop clause, and this stop clause is looking at a field value called com SMS notification. The fact that it's called SMS notification is not important. It is just a convenient field that is acting as the flag, and you can see that it's checking so long as notify is still set to be it's still set to be Y. So as long as it's that. So it's looking at SMS notification is null. Okay. What we've got is a check here now for SMS message sent. So as long as it's null, it will fire. And what we've got is in here the message being triggered off and being changed so that it will set this to be Y. So it's using this concept of being able to set the column value when the rule is fired to break the condition that causes the rule to fire. So basically, a stop clause is executed when a rule fires. It changes the data so that data is not going to be fired again. Okay. And I mentioned as well that we have this possibility of an interval. The interval is used, again this is defined in the screen, as a way of expressing in minutes when a rule should fire. You'll find that as escalation rules are triggered, they write into the SQL log. So if you've got logging enabled within your system, as I do, you will find lots of information being written in here that is coming from the workflow tables, and as workflow rules are executing, they will be triggered and you will see things going on in here as well. You can see here that there was another check, this time for delayed table level scripts, but we've got workflow rules being checked, and what you would see is in the SQL log extract evidence of how the interval is being used to determine when the next rule should be fired. So it changes the way in which once it's fired, it changes the data to reset when it should be next executed. We've got another set of concepts within escalation rules. We've looked at the idea of the stop clause and how a stop clause indicates that an escalation rule can change the data that is used within the system. So we see that in firing the rule, we change the data so it means that it doesn't fire again. Well, an adaptation of that idea is the adaptation of succession. Succession is when, if you fire a rule, it changes data that causes the conditions or changes the conditions that matches that for another rule, so another rule fires. So rule A fires, it creates the conditions that causes rule B to fire, that creates the conditions that rule C will fire. And you can have that idea of succession. And proper succession will progress until data is stable. But it is possible as well, sometimes for partners and customers, to create a situation called recursion, which is rule A fires, which creates the conditions that cause rule B to fire, which fires and causes the condition rule C to fire, which again fires, which causes rule A to fire. And that's not a desirable outcome, because you can get caught up in a very heavy demanded system until something happens, and that's usually a timeout.